Hi there! Okay, so first video, basically what my plan is, I have my little article right here. I read it, I took some notes, highlighted some things, and I just want to kind of go through it with you and talk about things that I thought were interesting, and then some things that I also just kind of thought of along the way as I was reading. And to begin with, the article is titled Cripping, Sex Education, Gaps and Opportunities for Sex Education for LGBTQ Adults with Autism and or ADHD. It was written by Santinele Martino, Thomas Try, David J. Kinitz, Erin, Brennand, Alicia, Hughes, and Lindsay. And it was published on March 13th, 2025. I'm also going to just read the abstract verbatim. The abstract states, this study explores the experiences of LGBTQ adults with developmental disabilities in Alberta, Canada, regarding access to sex education. Despite a strong desire to learn about sexuality, they face significant barriers due to stigma, societal misconceptions, and lack of accessible resources. Through semi-structured interviews with 12 participants, the research identified gaps in current sex education, such as cis heteronormativity and the absence of intersectional content on disability and sexuality. Participants emphasized the need for inclusive, disability-tailored curricula. The findings advocate for reforms in sex education, promoting a crib approach that supports the sexual rights of disabled individuals. Water break. So one of the first things that I highlighted in this article that stood out to me was disabled people are entitled to what Ken Plumer has termed intimate citizenship. Intimate citizenship refers to the rights of individuals to make personal and autonomous decisions regarding their intimate lives. Fully agree. There's certain myths that include people with developmental disabilities cannot be LGBTQ, are not interested in romantic relationships, or that discussing their sexualities is inappropriate. And these widespread beliefs can lead support providers to feel unprepared or insufficiently trained to address the topic of sexuality with people with developmental disabilities. I definitely agree with this. Throughout my experience, a lot of my coworkers have shared with me that obviously talking about sex is very uncomfortable. Sexual trauma, gender identity, masturbation, sex in general is very uncomfortable, especially you're not sure if the client wants to open that door, you're not sure if you have the right education. Do you even know what to really say in the moment? And so I definitely agree with this sentiment that due to providers being unprepared, these myths are kind of compounded in a way. And so the article continues and talks about the concept of cripping. It involves questioning and dismantling the traditional, often exclusionary frameworks that define various aspects of life, including sexuality and sex education. The term cripping originates from the historically derogatory term cripple, which has soon been reclaimed by disabled communities. Whole concept of cripping is that you're questioning and dismantling the traditional framework that often excludes things such as sexuality or sex education. So for instance, cripping is not merely providing accommodations for disabled students in educational settings to adapt or assimilate, but rather to engage in the redesigning of spaces from a starting point or accessibility. And so when I read that, I took a little note because this reminded me about when I took a philosophy of disability class in college. My professor, she was teaching us about the difference between the medical model and the social model of disability, and how historically we've really only benefited / leaned on the medical model, and it's not very nuanced and it actually leaves a lot of gray area. And so when it comes to the social model of disability, it really talks about the perspective of how society plays a part and what it means to be disabled. And so this one example that really stood out to me that I still remember was that she talked about grocery stores and how obviously grocery stores are super common, everyone goes to them. But the thing is though, there are people who have hidden disabilities, right? And so a lot of mental disorders, but there's also some physical ones, right? So for example, chronic fatigue syndrome is something that some people struggle with. And so a simple task such as going to the grocery store isn't so simple if walking down the aisle is very cumbersome for you. And so she talked about the fact that what if we lived in a society in which we just always had chairs available, or we had more seating available in grocery stores. Like, would chronic fatigue syndrome really be as impactful in a world such as that? And so I just really thought about that, talking about like, it's not about simulation. Cripping is more so about like redesigning spaces and concepts from the standpoint of accessibility. Furthermore, Cripping means reimagining these areas to better meet the needs and desires of disabled individuals, ensuring they're included, respected, and empowered. I agree. And so the main point of this study was to gather suggestions from participants on how to improve or crip sex education to better meet the needs of LGBTQ+ disabled individuals. It goes on to say that although formal sex education is mandatory in public high schools across most provinces, Action Canada for Sex Health and Rights identified notable inconsistencies and gaps in the curriculum. Gender identity, abortion, and sexual pleasure are frequently omitted as detailed in provisional checklists. And additionally, as stated previously, educators feel unprepared to address these issues related to sexual orientation and gender identity. Another thing that I thought was really interesting was that there's also like a religious component when it comes to sex education, right? In Calgary, the largest city by population in Alberta, there are 177 publicly funded Catholic schools and 251 public schools, with approximately 60,000 students attending Catholic schools and 130,000 attending public schools. Many Catholic schools in Alberta exclude discussions on gender identity and sexual orientation from their sex education curricula, contributing to the broader inconsistencies and gaps in sex education and leaving many students without comprehensive information on these essential topics. Generally speaking, religious institutions, religious schools usually just like promote abstinence when it comes to sex education, or they don't really talk about it at all. This study just further points to the fact that when it comes to sex education, there's certain areas in which the religion of the area could be negatively impacting the access to information in this way. Participants of the study were asked about ways to make sex education more inclusive and effective for disabled people. This included exploring their experiences with existing sex education programs, identifying gaps and barriers they encountered, and suggesting specific changes that can improve relevance and accessibility of sex education for LGBTQ+ disabled individuals. Here are some of the findings of this study that I thought were super notable. Of the participants interviewed, some of the common things that they noticed was the general gaps within sex education. And so there's a lack of attention to the intersections of disability and sexuality. This lack of intersectional education leaves disabled individuals without the necessary knowledge pertinent to their identities. There seemed to have been an absence of content specific to autistic individuals. Furthermore, the harmful stereotypes perpetuated by the lack of representation in sex education is very harmful. One of the participants were actually quoted with saying, "I thought of disabled people as like invalids, like people who were incapable of taking care of themselves or like functioning in the world. Not just people who are differently abled, right?" So another common thing that I thought was interesting was the heteronormative sex education. Sex education was overwhelmingly cis-heteronormative, prioritizing and valuing cisgender and heterosexual experiences and identities. Water break. Two participants noted the lack of comprehensive education on gender diversity and sexuality. Next, there seemed to be limited depth and comprehensiveness. Many of the participants expressed dissatisfaction with the superficial and inadequate nature of the general sex education that they did receive. In general, they didn't feel prepared for contemporary life as high schoolers. It felt as if they were not prepared for real-life sex and relational experiences. One of the things that seemed to be beneficial was leaning on the community. Because school was super unhelpful, they decided to lean on one another. And the way that they did this was through educational topics within community, particularly through supports like conventions, events, and conferences. A lot of people in the study also talked about volunteering and some community work. And one of the examples also stated was being part of a university's LGBTQ advocacy center. In contrast, participants who did not receive community-based sex education nor adequate school-based education struggled to accept or understand their gender, sexual, and/or disabled identities. Participants also shared that conversations around disability and sexuality were prominent within LGBTQ spaces. Friend groups that were primarily queer and or disabled, representative of participants' shared identities, facilitated authenticity, safety, and a constructive learning environment. And the study goes on to talk about suggestions for sex education. We gotta move beyond a cis heteronormative sex education, which this would include diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. One of the participants emphasized the importance of starting with just basic acknowledgments, like even just the phrase, hey, there are other ways to be. Acknowledgement that other people exist. That was just really important because they never really heard that growing up. Another participant proposed a phased approach where sex education evolves progressively from elementary through middle school to gradually introduce and elaborate on diverse sexualities and gender identities. One of the participants suggested maybe in elementary school, kids are given information on different sexualities and gender. Middle school, there's more elaboration, introduce sex talks, mention homosexuality at the same time as a heterosexuality. And then in high school, you just elaborate further. Another suggestion is the need for more disability-tailored sex education. Specific needs of disabled individuals, and specifically the necessity for specialized content that represents the unique experiences of disabled people. One of the participants that was quoted in the study stated, "It's not really something that's talked about, whether it's mental disability, physical disability, because mechanics are different, emotions are different, everything is different, right?" And then another person in the study talked about the necessity for autism specific, because a lot of it was under the assumption that the people learning it will be like neurotypical, just average people without any impairments. So having a session about consent with an autistic person in mind, a very different conversation about than what a neurotypical person in mind, and just general communication. It goes on to talk about things that are important, such as social skills, building dating skills, recognizing what does flirting look like. These are all things that I think are part of sex education, and I think that a lot of autistic adults would really benefit from. At the end, it says our study contributes to the literature by showcasing the value of community as a mode of mutual solidarity and support for LGBTQ plus people with developmental disabilities. And drawing on crip theory, this study advocates for the cripping of sex education to challenge and dismantle exclusionary frameworks and to create more inclusive curricula. I think that's perfectly stated, and I agree with that fully. Some positive implications of including sex education is that a sex education curriculum that ensures representation can prevent sexual diseases, exploitation, and abuse, as well as promote general well-being. The benefits extend to non-LGBTQ students as well, feeling less constrained by rigid gender norms and developing a broader understanding of diverse gender and sexual identities and gender sexuality. There are a bunch of approaches to delivering sex education, and it can be more neurodivergent inclusive through considering sensory sensitivity furniture to utilizing universal design for learning principles like using non-word-based communication options. I really enjoyed reading that part of the article because, yeah, exactly. The world is our oyster. We can use whatever we want to make things make more sense. And so if a sensory sensitive furniture is going to help me get my point across to somebody for them to be able to digest and use that information outside of there, why not? Super cool. Also super important, disabled and LGBTQ people should be within the policy making. Another recommendation could be that schools can partner with local youth serving organizations that have expertise and resources on sex education to offer up-to-date information. And the article actually talks about an example of this. Reach One, Teach One North Dakota program was created through a community-engaged partnership between North Dakota State University and Planned Parenthood to ensure that comprehensive sex education was implemented within community settings despite operating within the socially conservative state of North Dakota. Super cool. And then lastly, I always want to include this, are the limitations of the study. It was pretty small. It had 12 participants. That's not a huge sample size. And there was a huge lack of racial and ethnic diversity within the participants that were giving their experiences. And again, not only is this a small sample size, but it's not very diverse. We're not hearing from any black, brown, or it just seemed like everybody was white that was talking here. And so I think that's important to mention about this study. I thought it was really cool to read. Please let me know your thoughts, and thank you. That was really cool.